Hey everyone, and welcome back. Welcome, Belinda.
Hello, everybody.
It's good to see you. Belinda, we were chatting just before this. I know you were on a live session a while back. Today, you're bringing something entirely new, though.
Yes. Yep. We're going to be learning a little bit about how to mix illustration with lettering together. So it should be a fun
Amazing.
time for everyone.
Yeah, I was saying to you, this is like the perfect segue because we got an entire day of hardcore lettering live sessions tomorrow. This is kind of bridging the gap. So a little bit of lettering, but this is really how to add embellishments and flourishes and those beautiful illustrative elements, right?
Yes. Yep.
Incredible. So without further ado, would you like to share your screen? I can't wait to see this.
Yes. Sounds great. So before I share my screen, just a brief overview of what you can expect today. I plan on sharing, for the sake of time, a little bit of description of the process that you would go through with how to integrate your illustration into your lettering, and then also get a little bit more deep into Procreate towards the end, show you a couple of demos, some tips maybe for Procreate on how you can take it into that refinement level using your brushes and some fun little features in Procreate as well. So let me go ahead
Amazing.
and share my screen. Great.
You know,
So
you know, I've been geeking out over your Instagram work for a long time, Belinda. It's so
thanks
beautiful.
so much. Yeah, so I wanted to share with you all a bit of what I've been working on recently. It's a side project of mine, and it'll give you an idea of the kind of illustration and lettering style that you'll get to see today and learn how to do. So this is a series that I've called Hungrily Ever After, and it's a mix of hand lettering and illustration that plays off of two things that I'm really obsessed with, which is food and also fairy tales, and just playing with those phrases in fun ways as we go through each story. So just to share with you some of the ones I've done so far, this is the main image, and you can see that it's mocked up on a book cover. And part of that is because my goal in the series is to have a portfolio of book cover art that I can hopefully get hired for in the future. So that's part of the purpose of the series. This first one here is for The Little Mermaid. So for Disney fans, it's a play off of I Want to Be Where the People Are, the Little Mermaid lyrics. But instead, since she's a big foodie, she wants to be where the cookies are. So that's that first one. And you can see how the illustrations and the lettering kind of mix together that I'll show you how to do. And then the second one is based off of Cinderella. I'm just here for the food until midnight because she has a curfew. Her priority is not the prince. Her priority is to try out all the food that the king and queen are putting up because it must be really good. And why not have it be pumpkin themed for her carriage? We have Who's the Hungriest of Them All, which is the play off of Who's the Fairest of Them All in Snow White. And then we have Sleeping Beauty, Wake Me Up When the Food's Ready. She's the one who likes to sleep and, let somebody else do the cooking, pulling imagery from the movie as well. And then this one I shared recently is Rapunzel, and it's based off of Disney's version of Rapunzel's, that song, Mother Knows Best, but this foodie version, she would say that her stomach knows best. So
These look amazing, Belinda, and I love that you've continued the food theme. The previous session we did with Belinda, you did these kind of food elements weaving around your lettering, kind of similar to this, and I loved it. But I mean this is like a big compliment. I would say your skills have even leveled up since that last session. This looks, that was incredible, but this is like a whole new level. It's so impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, with each new project, you just kind of push yourself a little further. So my own personal goals here would be to definitely level up on the illustration and lettering integration. So I'm excited to share with you how to do that here today.
Amazing.
All right, so we are going to move into a little demo of how I created one of those pieces. So this one is the one from Snow White. Who's the hungriest of them all? Seems like some people are already getting hungry. So we'll see by the end of this who really is the hungriest of them all. And when you start a piece, like any kind of lettering and illustration piece, the first thing that you want to do is write out your phrase. Make sure that that phrase is final and that you're good with it, and then go from there. So as you can see here, this is something that I would typically do in my sketchbook just because it's a little bit faster for me, but for demonstration purposes, I'll do it in Procreate so you can see it better. And I have written in my own handwriting, so nothing pretty, who's the hungriest of them all. And since we're going to cover lettering more tomorrow, I'm just going to do a really brief overview on the process for this. But when you are looking at your phrase, before you even start into the lettering composition part, I'd recommend just going through and identifying what is the most important word in there, or what are your primary words, your secondary words, tertiary, and that will help you to figure out the priorities of how you start to shape your composition. So for this phrase in particular, who's the hungriest of them all? I'm just going to box the most important one. Who's the hungriest? So that is the one that we want to highlight. It's also the thing that makes this a foodie phrase, not just a fairy tale phrase. So we'll put that one first. And then who's in them all is more of the secondary, and then followed by the and of, which are just, you know, little words that you can intersperse in your layout. All right, so we have our priorities identified. Step 2 now would be to start thinking about how we're going to integrate our illustrations. So one reason why I would recommend starting at the concept phase with your illustrations is so that when you get to that final part of your composition, you already have an idea of what sorts of embellishments you want to add. So what we're going to do is we'll just come up with a quick list. Again, not drawing anything yet, just thinking about stuff of what you would find for elements for Snow White. And you can feel free to start throwing those out in the chat too. And what kind of elements you would find for food that you can draw in this kind of composition. So when I think about Snow White, imagery that comes to mind would include, let's see, apples. We have maybe, if we were to stretch the apple theme even further, it could be like apple pie, apple tarts. Apple cider, because it's fall over here and it's in the Midwest. It's a very common thing. Yep, lots of apples being mentioned.
I'm feeling the apples.
Yeah, definitely apples. We'll definitely include apples in there. We have the Queen and Snow White. So rather than draw them out, maybe we can represent them with symbols like a crown. Snow White could be like her hair tie, a little ribbon, maybe some animals because she loves animals. And then this would probably be one of the more important elements, would be the mirror, apple cobbler, yum. All right, hope you all are getting hungry. Okay, so now we have our list and we're going to set that aside. But as we create our composition for our layout, we can allow this list to inform us on how we want to create our compositions, because we already know up front what we want to include in there. I can even go through and just star what I want to include. So apples, hands down, will definitely be something we'll draw. And then the mirror, I would say, are probably our 2 biggest priorities. So we have our list, and we're now going to move on to setting up the layout for our lettering. I'll use a different color here. And again, trying to just sort of breeze over this lettering portion, since you'll get more details on that tomorrow. But when you're looking at your letters and you've identified your priorities, when you start to create composition, a fun trick to make the composition part a little bit easier is to see each of your words as more of a block than actual letters. So you're working with shapes instead of with words. So I'm going to go through and just box around the remaining words that I've identified. And I'll see in total, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 boxes that I get to play with and move around from my composition. So for example, we can do a layout that's more symmetrical and stacked. Who's the, it's a smaller word, hungriest. And when we want to identify the primary words, a great way to highlight it is playing with scale or weight or style. We'll get to that later, but I know that scale will definitely be one of them. So I'm drawing this box a little bit bigger. And then of can be here maybe, and then them all. And when you're doing this composition part, I personally would recommend doing at least 3 to 5 of these, just so that you can challenge yourself to come up with better ideas as you go. So maybe we do like 3 to 5 ideas. All right, so let's pretend that we came up with 3 to 5 ideas, and we're gonna go with something like this one. But you can, again, we're working with blocks and we can shape them up and make them look really interesting, so we can take them a step further. So for example, now that I'm thinking about my list over here, I know that a mirror is something that I really want to integrate. Maybe we can be inspired by the curves of the mirror and start to curve our letters around like that too. So for example, instead of having just this kind of straight lined block over here, maybe it's more of an arc. And Maybe hungriest can be more of this sort of arched style, which I like to use a lot because it's not an easy style for you to manipulate fonts into. So it's something that I feel like hand lettering lends itself to a really easy way to have that kind of style, whereas fonts don't, and it makes it more obvious that it was something that was drawn by a person then typed out. And we can have of right here, and then maybe them all is also this arc. So I'll just move this over a little bit to give it some space. Now you can see that your layout is starting to take a little bit more shape, and we're going to start to add in our illustrations. We are still in very rough sketch form, so for anyone who feels like their sketches don't look great, that's totally fine. That's actually like perfect for what you're doing here because it's only being seen by you, so you can just keep sketching very roughly, very messily, and allow your ideas to at least show up on paper or on a screen visually, and then we'll start to build off from there. So if you're like me and you forget words a lot, like these blocks, you can also go in and just write it. So let's do we'll stack them together, hungriest. You can see it's super messy. It's not what it's going to look like in the final, but that's just to help me remember what are these words? Question mark. Okay, so now when we look at our list, we can think about what are some interesting ways to integrate a mirror into this composition, and what's a fun way to do apples. Well, since this is a play off of Who's the Fairest of them all, which is when the queen is asking the mirror to show her who's the fairest, why don't we make the mirror a very central element to our composition? And also another thought was, wouldn't it be interesting if the lettering was actually on the mirror? So you can just do something like this, where you're telling in your sketch, you're telling yourself, all right, I'm going to put my lettering into a mirror, and maybe I can throw some apples around it. And as you saw from my different series that I've done so far, I like to do like an explosion of food just to give it some more energy. And also I feel like that translates how excited I am when I think about food. So, we can do like an explosion of food. We just do simple shapes here, but apple slices could be a fun way to vary up that shape. If we wanted the pie, why not just ground it at the bottom of that mirror? And to make it more of a royal mirror that the queen is talking to, maybe we can put her crown in because it's pretty symbolic. And
this is so fun. This is like the ultimate brainstorming visual exercise. Like I actually love this part of the creative process, to be honest.
It's a very fun part because you're not getting into the nitty gritty of the details yet. And it's just all the ideas. And ideas are like fun to just throw out there and see if, how things stick together. So I agree. It's definitely a fun part. So maybe we can I decided, let's have a bird up there and we can, symbolize Snow White with like a ribbon and just very simple strokes to kind of just allow you to figure out where pieces are going to start to fall in place, keeping in mind how everything is going to be balanced out. So when you're adding your illustrations in this phase, a few things that you want to ask yourself is, one, does what I'm drawing make sense to this message? Am I just drawing flowers because I like flowers, or does flowers actually mean something when I'm talking about who's the hungriest of them all? And personally, I think, it looks like flowers and botanicals. And I found a way to work in flowers into this one because I was thinking, well, if we're doing apples, we can do the apple tree, the leaves, we can do apple blossoms. So that was my little way of sneaking in flowers into this composition in a way that made sense.
I don't want to skip ahead, but I can already get a bit of a sense for it here. Your compositions are never flat. They always feel super dynamic and full of energy. And it's amazing that's captured even at the super early phase. And that's something I can't remember exactly what the food was, but in the last session, I remember it was like weaving almost towards you, right? Am I remembering that right in the last session? And that seems a very common theme in your work. It's like just this explosion instead of just flat elements placed there. I wonder if you could talk on like how you plan that out from this early phase even.
Yeah, so I mean, one easy way to kind of create that energy is if you think about, like, I have a bowl of apples, or maybe like something small like grapes, and you just like toss it in the air. That's sort of what I think about when I start drawing my compositions, because just that act of, throwing something in the air and capturing it with like a camera is capturing something that's already in motion, but in a still frame. But it gives you that feeling of motion. And I like that because I like the explosion of food, because I feel like it's the same thing as like explosion of energy and excitement when you think about food. And then also finding ways to overlap. So here you can start to think about your foreground, your middle ground, and your background, and how you can get those things to interact in, a 3D plane for your lettering too. So
very cool.
play that out.
Hopefully there's some people after this that are going to be throwing fruit bowls up in the air. Get the iPhone out, trying to photograph it.
Yeah, just capturing some energy. Just going back in here, I know at one point during my brainstorm, I decided to put this into a ribbon. And that's just something that I like to do sometimes. I like to throw my letters into banners when they make sense, just to give it a little bit more of that overlap, where now instead of just something that's directly on the mirror, it's on a banner that's in front of the mirror, and it can kind of interact in that way to make it look like there's some depth. And I was also inspired by just royal crowns and seals. They have a tendency to have banners in some of those too. So just pulling a little bit of that royal aspect into this illustration. Okay, amazing. So this is our brainstorm, and you can spend a short amount of time there. I wouldn't spend too much time. Like, you don't want to get yourself into any refinement of details at this phase, because it's just about getting your ideas out. Once we have that, we'll move into a new canvas. And this is to show you what that sketch ultimately ended up looking like. And because I get this question a lot, I'll go ahead and show the canvas info so that you can see here. I tend to set up my canvases at 8 inches by 10 inches at 300 DPI, so that if I ever wanted to print it at, just a little size of a regular picture frame, I can. And 300 DPI is the minimum that you want to set your canvas at. If you do plan on printing, you can go even higher, and same with your size too. I just found that 8 by 10 happens to be the perfect size, where it's still a 4 by 5 ratio, which is great for Instagram. It can still be printed, but it still gives me like 70 to 80 layers to work with, because I have a tendency to use up all my layers in my work. So
you're not alone.
Yeah, that was my sort of happy compromise, I guess, for my canvas. And another question I get a lot is how you get something to be more smooth in your final work. Like, as you can see here, everything is super roughly sketched. My answer to that, one of the answers, is you work in layers and in waves. So your first wave you saw, my previous one, was a very rough sketch and just kind of like, only like 3 inches tall at most. Now I've moved it into a bigger canvas, and I'm going to simply turn down this opacity, which, by the way, if you ever want a shortcut, you can just take 2 fingers and tap to pull up your opacity slider and slide on your screen. Turn that down, and then on a new layer, start to refine my composition in a much more finessed way. And one thing that I do use that I think you'll see more of tomorrow is the grid builder brushes. Let's see here. And I need to try out Shoutbam's layout brushes too, because I think together that will be a complete set of digital rulers for you to work with to cut out your time when you want to set up your layouts. So I would go through to do that, and then I would go over and draw my letters. That takes me the longest time. And especially now, I'm in this series, I am challenging myself to use styles that I'm not as familiar with. So it takes me a little bit more time. And when it comes to choosing the different types of styles you want to use with your lettering, you think back to your brainstorm session and the original concept. So for me, I'm combining food with fairy tales. So for my lettering styles, I decided to combine modern lettering with more vintagey storybook lettering, as you can start to see it begin to evolve in this canvas. And just to show you, because this takes me a while, this is now the next more refined state of my sketch. And we're still in black and white. We haven't applied color yet, because we're trying to get our illustration locations down, as well as the refinement of our lettering. And here, before you move into your colors, is when you start to look at your overall composition. a nice simple way is just to like zoom out really small to see how
Oh,
things
that's
are
a good tip.
balanced. And I've actually had a friend mention to me that you can also turn it upside down when you're looking at your letters so that you're just seeing shapes and not being swayed by the individual letters that you're looking at, to start to figure out how are things balanced. And you'll do this again, like zoom out really small when you're starting to add color too.
I really want to see this on the back of a playing card or something.
Yeah,
It
that
has
would be
that real like
fun.
tactile feel to it.
Yes. And I was just going to pull up to here. The 5X update has this reference window right here that allows you to refer to your entire composition in real time. Even when you're like super zoomed in here, you can still see your overall composition in that window. So that's a
Ooh,
nice little update.
that's amazing.
Slight tangent. If you have a newer iPad, I'm not going to click on it, but that far right spot has this space here where you can like paint on your face, and it's really fun entertainment. I actually don't really know what good it does, like what it's for, but if you want to paint on your face, you can use this feature to do that.
You can paint
All
on
right,
your face.
you can paint on your face. It's almost like face filters that you get on Instagram, so maybe that's what it could be used for. But
Oh,
literally draw on there and it'll show up on your face like digital
oh my
makeup.
God. We might need to invite you back just for that. That sounds so funny.
Yeah, it can be a lot of amusing time for you to make up random stuff to
Good
draw
one
on yourself.
to do with the kids, maybe.
I did do with my kids. I drew mustaches on them and they had a blast. All right. So we are now in the next phase. Just to summarize what we've done so far, we've done a little bit of brainstorming and rough sketching. We've taken that sketch and refined it. We've taken it and refined it even more. And now we're going to start to color everything and add dimension and depth and texture and finalize this thing. So when we're looking here, you can see I've now turned down the opacity of my sketch layer, and I've, on a new layer, added a bunch of refined elements like this lettering here. The first thing I'm going to do for my color is I'm going to fill my background color. And I'm going through the rainbow in this series, if you didn't notice in the beginning, and this happens to land on purple. So I already knew that the background for Snow White will be purple. And I've got color swatches up at the top of 6 different colors. Just a quick summary of how I do that. I usually pick my main color for my background, and then I'll pick a complementary color as an accent, which is what I'll use to highlight some of my words. And then I have a secondary accent color, these reds, which was inspired just because I knew that apple was going to be a big focus for this illustration. So a form of red would be great for that. And then some darker purples to go with the background and include some of my illustrations without overpowering my lettering. So that's some of my reasoning behind my colors. I'm going to go into my lettering folder and start to colorize these. We'll start with hungriest, which I decided to be yellow because I wanted that to be the main focus. And then we're just going to pick a white color for our other lettering. And if you can see here, I have these on alpha lock, which is what that checkered background is. And for those who don't know what alpha lock is, it basically locks all the pixels of what you drew on that layer so that even if you were to try to draw on top of it, you can only draw on that section. And it makes it really easy for you to switch colors as you're trying to figure out what the colors will be. And you access that just by tapping on your layer and hitting alpha lock, or you can take 2 fingers and swipe right on it to trigger that. So we have our colors, and now we're going to add some dimension to hungriest, which I already did here, but I can show you how I did that. You duplicate the layer, fill it with another color, and simply move it down a little bit. If you wanted it to be a little bit more, have some perspective, we can just scale it down a little and make sure that it's centered. And the reasoning for the centering is because this entire composition is a very symmetrical composition, so it makes sense to have your dimension vanishing point and the center. And
Yeah, I guess
we
it would throw the eye if everything was very symmetrical, but that shot off to one side or something.
Yeah, like if I were to have hungriest slant and point towards the left, it wouldn't make
Yeah.
as much sense because everything else is balanced so straight up and down.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Definitely.
No, it's looking awesome. I love the vintage type as well that you've done
Yes.
in the
Yep.
center there. It's beautiful.
Seems like a fun thing to do, to just have a smattering of vintage elements thrown into the more modern illustration and other lettering that I have here. So what I was doing here was I was just connecting the corners to create that dimension. There are a lot of different techniques to create dimension for 3D letters. I like this one because it's almost like a very therapeutic thing to do, to just color in here. And I would go through and connect all those lines. I already did it here just so that you wouldn't have to watch me do that forever. But now suddenly we have dimension to hungriest, and it's starting to take shape a little bit. So we have that down. We're going to continue to work with just flat colors. So I will ultimately add more textures to this, but I'm not going to do it yet. I want to get all my colors down first. Let's start with our banner. Now, another fun feature in Procreate for a very symmetrical composition like this is, instead of having to draw this entire banner from left to right, I see that it is symmetrical on both sides. So I'm going to use the symmetry tool. And you go to that by going to Actions, and you go to Drawing Guide. You turn that on, and make sure you're under Canvas there, as you can see me clicking around. Turn on Drawing Guide, go into Edit, and at the bottom here on the far right, you'll see that there's symmetry. And this is a very fun tool to work with. If you click on Options, you'll see that there's vertical symmetry, horizontal, quadrant, and radial. If you've never used this tool before, I would encourage you to try it with radial, because it's a lot of fun and can create this very cool doodle for you with very minimal effort.
We had a session on that recently with lettering flourishes, which was so great.
Yeah, it's so much fun, and like you can see it in real time too. So,
Belinda, is it just me, or is Procreate, like, it's getting so powerful under the hood? I think a lot of people open it up and think it's this kind of basic piece of software, but there's so many settings being built out. It's like a really robust piece of software these days.
Yes, and plus a lot of us are using Procreate for client work too. And when you're only paying $10 for Procreate compared to hundreds of dollars for Adobe, it's quite a huge difference. And a part of me almost wonders if they're planning on rolling out some sort of subscription service eventually, when they realize how useful it is for everyone. But
yeah,
please don't.
Don't tell them, guys.
Please don't do that. Yeah. Okay, so you can see now I have chosen vertical symmetry here. I'm going to hit done. And up here, you can change your guidelines so that you can see it. We'll just set it to white so you can see it from there. Now, if I were to draw, I'll see that on that layer I'm drawing on, it says assisted under layer 66, which is the layer I'm drawing on. Who else doesn't name their layers? When I draw in real time, you can see it reflects vertically on both sides. So definitely, I think somebody said it was a huge time saver. Yes, major time saver. And what I'm doing here is I just rotated my canvas, which is another strategy you can use to create smoother lines, which is basically working with the natural rotation of your hand. So if you're right-handed, when you curve your hand like this, it forms a natural C shape, whereas drawing a backwards C is a lot harder. So why not rotate your canvas every time you're drawing a curve so that it goes in that natural direction of that C? And in case you're wondering, the brush I'm using here is the Ink Bleed, because it has this nice rough texture to it, like very toothy texture. And I just happen to like a lot of texture in my work, so that's the brush I'm using. And it has generally a nice, it can fill without too much issue. Now we have our banner. We'll take a darker color, and on a new layer, you can simply draw a shape behind in that woven part of your banner to give it some of that 3D look. Oh, and I'm going to undo this, because what you can do is you can just tap on this layer and click Drawing Assist, and that will also be symmetrical. so I can just do it on one side of my banner. As you can see, it's reflected on both sides now.
Isn't it nice having a limited color palette? It just takes
It
so
is.
much guesswork out.
It does. And if you're ever struggling with colors, I would recommend limiting it as much as you can, like even 2 colors, so that you only have 2 colors to work with and you're forced to choose how you're going to show different parts of your illustration through only 2 colors.
Mm-hmm.
Let's work on our apple. And that was one thing from the beginning when you had your list. You can think about fun ways to directly incorporate your illustrations into your lettering. So here, using a word as short as of, where it's just 2 letters, seemed like a prime opportunity to put it in an apple. And that way your apple is in the middle of your composition because it's a main food element that you think of when you're thinking of Snow White, without fighting with your letters as well, because they're together.
I feel like you thought of everything. How long did it take you? Because you kind of flew through it to show us the process. Is it a lot longer for you to come up with such a clever composition, or does it flow pretty naturally?
It flows about at that pace now, only because I've done it so many times. So you've mentioned in the last time we met that I had compositions similar to that, and that was 15 pieces that I did there. So I've just been creating a lot of pieces like this, and it comes more naturally. I say the first time ever, like if you're just starting out and you're thinking, okay, tomorrow I'm going to create something kind of similar to this style. How long is it going to take me to plan that? I would say anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, including thinking time, where you're thinking like, does this work? Does it not work? What styles I want to do? Yeah, but
that sounds like a happy medium, because that's relatively quite quick, but at the same time you're clearly not just jumping right in without thinking it through. You know, if it's up to 2 hours, that's a healthy window of really planning out the details. And is it fair to say that really sets up the entire project? I think people often want to skip past the planning section. It's like boring. They want to just get down to the lettering and the drawing.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to force yourself to, no matter what, start with a rough sketch. Don't just start in a blank Procreate board and immediately begin with this masterpiece of lettering. You want to work in different waves, and the sketch will really help you to figure out that composition, figure out where all your lettering elements are going to be placed, as well as where your illustration elements will be, so that everything is, as you said, thought out and intentional, and not seeming like an afterthought in the end.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we have our banner, we have a little bit of dimension to our letters. Let's bring in our mirror. For time's sake, I created 2 ovals already, as you can see. And what we are going to do is we'll start to add some framework to our mirror. And this one is actually with a brush that I don't think is mentioned, Shout Bam's brush pack. I like their brush pack too.
Oh, which one?
It is their Rough and Raw brush pack, and I'm using the monoline stamp.
Mm-hmm.
Real quick, you can see it.
Such a fun pack for texturing.
Yes, and I love texture, so they have some really great texture brushes in there. And what I decided was I'm turning off the lettering layers right now, and I put them all in a group so it'd be easy for me to turn those on and off. I'm taking this monoline stamp because it has that even monoline weight to it, but it's got some texture so that I can create the frame around the mirror and give it an antique-y feel at the same time without doing too much work, other than just drawing these curls like that. And again, because this is symmetrical, I can do drawing assist so that I have it mirrored, no pun intended, on both sides.
I love a good pun. Well played.
So just something like this. And figuring out how things are going to curl around and stuff, that also takes time. But again, if you do it at the sketch phase, it won't take you as much time as it would later on.
So once you've done some of these outside flourishes, do you stop and reflect on how far you've come?
You mean just so
Sorry,
far?
I had to
Oh,
slip another pun
I
in
see.
there.
I totally missed your pun. Sorry. I get it now. Sometimes when I slow on the uptake, I ruin the punchline. I'm sorry.
It's all right, I went full dad joke.
Okay, so we have our mirror, we have our lettering that I can turn back on now just to see how it's interacting with those flourishes in the back. I'm turning on a crown because that didn't take too long to draw. I'm not going to show it here because that was, you don't need to see that part. And I'm going to turn on a few more layers just so that you can see how the color is dispersing. So there's the leaves here. The bottom portion is mirrored. And then I go back in and I add in some of these little thorns that are coming out in different ways so that it doesn't look like it's perfectly symmetrical, because sometimes when everything is too perfect, it looks more computerized and less hand-done, I guess. So I like to add in some of that.
That's actually a really good tip. I don't want anyone to skip over that. Like, just some super subtle differences can ultimately make the world of difference, right?
Yes.
That's something I feel like people often forget. They get so caught up in using the symmetry tool, and just a stray leaf changes the whole feel of the overall composition.
Right. And as you can see, the leaves at the top, they're not perfectly mirrored anymore. They're just kind of floating around and drifting about the mirror for some of that motion. We'll turn on our apple layer. I'm going to turn some of that off because I'll show you how to do that in a second. And we'll just add the bird and the bow. Okay, so now you can see that things are starting to take shape. We don't really need that sketch layer anymore. So now that I've turned it off, you can see more of the true colors. And I will bring in my frame, which is an element that I have in all of my pieces, as well as this banner. So you can see now everything is starting to come together.
A little knife and fork banner. That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's got the scroll that you would see in like a storybook, but we added the knife and the fork to make it more of a foodie twist.
I swear I've been like smiling through half of this session. It's so nice.
All right, so let's add some dimension now. I'll show you a few tricks on how to do that. One thing is if you're adding dimension to your hand lettering, and this is the same technique that you would use on any of your other objects that you're working with, we're going to use clipping masks. Now, you can also use alpha lock, but clipping masks are great because you can move them around later. And if you're like me and you change your mind a lot about your colors, you can adjust that later without having to redo your shading. So for example, if I wanted to add some shadows to the red dimension part of hungriest, I'm on my clipping mask and I'm going to take another brush. I like texture brushes, so this is another brush pack that I use a lot, which is I have to say it slowly, Gouache Shader Brush Pack. And they have this really nice variety of, you've got some rougher line textures as well as all of these speckled dots that get a little bit more solid as you go down. I'm picking something earlier on that has the smattering of speckles, sorry. And I'm going to just shade on top of it, my demo layer. And since it's on a clipping mask, you don't have to really be too perfect with where it's going. You just figure out where your light source is, which is, for me, the top left-ish. And you start to add in about where those shadows will be. And then you take a brush. I use 6B pencil because it's still another textury brush. And you erase to form hard edges like here, like where the leg of the H and the crossbar meet. That will be a hard shadow. So we're going to make that a hard edge. And then down here too, where the things are dipping. So that was just a demo that I showed. I'm going to turn on what I actually did so that you can see. You go on it a few different times. But as you can see now, it gives that hungriest a little bit more depth, right?
Yeah, that's so cool.
Okay, so that's one way to add some more shadows to your work. Another way is creating a background shadow too, which you would do by duplicating that lettering again or that object that you're trying to shade. fill it with a darker color, which this time will be darker than the background, that dark purple. I just removed the alpha lock because I'm actually going to blur it a little bit. So if I move this layer down a little bit, you can see that shadow start to show up right here. And then now, alpha lock removed, go to adjustments, Gaussian blur, and you hit layer because we're going to apply it to the entire layer. If I drag my finger across, you can see at the top that Gaussian blur percentage is changing. You can see how much blurrier that the shadow is going to get. So now it's a softer shadow rather than a hard edge shadow. And then you can adjust
This
it
is
to
really
where you
kind of,
want.
it's really jumping off the canvas now, Belinda.
Yes, it is.
Nice.
And then adjust opacity a little bit to where you would like it to be. Sometimes setting it to multiply also helps because it will mix with the color that's below it. And that is another way to add depth to your lettering or your objects. So let's do it on an illustration piece. We'll do a clipping mask, and we're going to do a similar thing to what we did with that dimension here, but now I'm going to add some more shadows on my banner with a darker color. We're clipping on a clipping mask, it's clipping to the pixels that are just below it. So I'm going to where I think it's going to be darker with that texture brush. And then you go back in and, oh, I should have used the symmetry tool for this, but I didn't. More work for me. You can go through and erase where those edges would be. I can even, if you hit your paintbrush and hold down on your eraser, it'll erase with that same texture brush that I used, which is a nice little shortcut, and made that edge a little bit of a blended edge as opposed to that hard edge that my 6B pencil was doing originally.
I like that there's quite a lot of texture in this piece and different textures, but it's so subtle that it still feels quite clean.
Yes, yeah, and you get this nice mix of texture and solid patterns together.
Mm-hmm.
That's not too noisy.
Yeah, it's got character.
It's got character. All right, oops, I'm drawing with my pencil back. Yeah, so you can adjust the opacity on a clipping mask too, which is nice if I wanted it to be more subtle. So now it looks like your banner is starting to overlap on each other just with one simple extra layer. Then I can do one more thing and then show you the rest. Okay, so we'll go to the apple. Again, using that same brush, or you can pick a different brush from the pack. You just add a little bit of a darker color to it. You can keep layering on top at the edge for that darker shadow. You see more of a gradient of that pattern going out.
And sorry, Belinda, do you mind just re-clarifying what brush that is for anyone who's joining right now?
Sure thing. It is the Gouache Shader Brush Pack, and I'm using shader number 4 in case anybody here who's watching has that brush pack right now and wants to try it.
Gouache brushes are really fun to work with, actually.
They are, yeah.
They're up there for me. It's like watercolor and gouache, and yeah, all things fun.
Yep, gotta love the textures.
Mm-hmm.
Oops, I cleared it. Fill that layer. We're gonna make another shadow. And another shortcut for this with a new update is because there is both a layer and a pencil option. If you swipe left or right directly on that button, it'll allow you to skip that extra tap, which I'm all about minimizing the amount of taps it takes to get to a feature. Okay, so swipe left, blur that out a little bit, move that shadow down, and turn down that opacity. And you basically go through every one of your objects to add in those shadows. You can even use a lighter color and add in a highlight to make it even more dimensional. The more intermediate colors you add, the more realistic it's going to get. I like to stick to just 2 to 3 layers on top so that it still has illustrative quality and doesn't get too hyper realistic. And I'm just going to wrap this up now because the rest is basically the same thing over and over again, and turn on some of the layers I had already. So that you're not watching me do the same thing over and over again. And I can turn off.
That looks so cool.
You can go and remove that drawing guide so you don't see the line. And one last thing to give it just a little bit more subtle depth is you can take an airbrush, like this soft brush here, make it kind of a bigger brush. I'm on the very bottom layer, and you can start to see now my mirror looks a little bit backlit, if you can see a bit of that white right there.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I don't like how blurry that is, I want to blur it more, I can do my Gaussian blur and blur it out some more. And sometimes I'll set it to overlay so that it's a bit more pink than it is just plain white.
So good.
That would essentially wrap up your piece.
I love that so much. Belinda, thank you for sharing. That was another amazing session, everyone. I love the outcome. It's always fantastic watching you work, and thank you for the great answers there at the end as well. It's just been such a pleasure having you on.
Thanks for having me. Thank you everyone for joining.
We can't wait to welcome you back.
Yes.
All right. Thanks so much.
Have a great day /night/morning for everyone.
Cheers, Belinda. Chat soon.
Bye.